Hello and welcome to another bonus episode of the Commodore 64 Budget Publisher Showdown. If you've followed this series since the start, you'll know that myself and a group of guests discussed some of the most notable games from Mastertronic, Firebird and Codemasters, and eventually determined that the best of the three publishers was Mastertronic. That was the view of some C64 fans, but what about the biggest C64 magazine of the time? Well, in this video we'll be taking a look at how Zzap 64 rated games from the three budget publishers and ultimately which one they ranked the highest based on those ratings. I can't take any credit for the idea for this video though, as this was the brainchild of my guest for this episode and another man who never tires of talking about Commodore 64 budget games, Warren Pilkington, aka Woz.
Hello you, as another channel might say, and hello Matt. Pleasure to be back. Always good to chat about some of the great games back then that you didn't have to pay very much money for. So a little bit about the idea for this. Obviously, most people will have bought Zzap 64 when they were growing up in their 64 era. A lot of people swore by the reviews in terms of what they said pretty much was kind of the de facto standard of what game was good, what game was not good. And obviously, they did review a considerable number of budget games over the years.
Yes, indeed. So what we're going to do in this video is go through those reviews, not all of them, but perhaps you just want to start off by telling us where you got the data from for the different magazine reviews.
So, got to give a big heads up to the folks at zzap64.co.uk website, the likes of Mort and other people who maintain it, as they have a section on their website called the Zzap Bible. This lists every single game reviewed in Zzap and then later Commodore Force, post Zzap 64 era. Every single game reviewed in terms of name, publisher, rating, what issue, what page. That made things considerably easier for putting all the stats together. So, my huge thanks for them for maintaining that, because they do a great service for the scene in general with all the scans and so on as well, which is obviously much appreciated. And I know, for example, they're linked on Lemon as well, which obviously you've referred to in your reviews. So it was fairly straightforward to get all the various sub-labels from each publisher. Once I got all those sort of numbers together into a sheet, it was then a case of filtering out all the re-releases, and there were a considerable number of those to filter out, particularly more so from, say, Mastertronic. But notably, one re-release, which people might not realise, is the original version of Kickstart. This actually was released by Mr. Chip Software themselves in 1984, before then getting a re-release on Mastertronic in 1985. As such, as it's a re-release, that's been discounted in the scores. So there'll be people going, oh, but Kickstart's not in there, but they've got 90%. That is the answer why.
Yeah, I must admit I hadn't realised that either. Back when I was doing my Mastertronic series all those years ago and I reviewed Kickstart, I would have seen that as an original Mastertronic release rather than a re-release. I think there's a couple of other games that probably fell into that category as well, where I just didn't have the knowledge that I perhaps do have now. So yeah, well spotted. And yeah, as you say, we won't be including anything that's a re-release, hopefully. If we do, then we apologise in advance and someone will point it out. Okay, so what we're going to do in this first part of this video then is look at the top 10 games from each publisher based on the review scores that they were given in Zzap and decide whether we agree or not. Much as I did with the original series, we'll go through in the order of Mastertronic, Firebird and Codemasters. Let's keep things consistent in that respect. So we'll start with Mastertronic, and their top 10 is topped by Spore with 97%. Also featured in there is Spellbound, Finders Keepers, Kentila, Revenge of the Mutant Camels 2, or Jeff Minter's Revenge 2 as it was noted on the front cover, Flash Gordon, Beat It, Master of Magic, Kickstart 2, and Pod, or Proof of Destruction to give it its full title. So pretty good top 10 there. I wasn't a huge fan of the Magic Knight games, I must admit. I probably wouldn't have them quite as high up, and I'm not really sure that Spore warranted a 97% rating, which is incredibly complimentary. There's a text adventure in there as well, Kentila, which I wouldn't have really enjoyed. Otherwise, I think those games are pretty good. Perhaps we should really talk about the motorbike-shaped elephant in the room there, which is Kickstart 2. Only got 86%. What do you think about that?
I'm obviously a Sean Southern fan, as you're aware, Matt, but even so, I mean, Kickstart 2 is better than 1. Many people still cite it as their best budget game. In fact, there was a 40th anniversary C64 article written by Craig Granell recently, and Kickstart 2 was the only budget game in that top 10 list that he provided. So that does say a lot. I personally would have given Kickstart 2 and Pod at least a sizzler. You've probably kind of expected that. And most of the remainder are pretty much essential Mastertronic games to buy as well. I mean, I can't really argue with anything there. Obviously, Cantila's going to be debatable if you like text and graphic advantage, but you do have the 13 minutes Rob Hubbard soundtrack as well. So, you could be excused for paying £2 for buying it for the soundtrack, but all the rest are absolutely solid. Beat It is hugely underrated. It's a sort of sequel to Jammin'. I can highly recommend that. That might be one that people might have had under the radar and not played, so do check that one out.
Yeah, and Master of Magic, I quite enjoyed that. So sort of top-down view role-playing game. One of the only decent games that the Darling brothers did for Mastertronic, really, when you look at it. Perhaps Chiller wasn't too bad, but everything else was pretty deplorable. But yeah, Kickstart 2, I mean, as you mentioned, the original game got 90%, and this is better graphics, the course designer, adding the speedometer as well, so you can tell whether you're going too fast or too slow for some of the obstacles. How it got less than the original game is a bit beyond me, to be honest.
Yeah, I've got to agree on that. Definitely Kickstart 2 should have been at least in the early to mid-90s.
Yeah, well, generally speaking, pretty decent top 10. I don't necessarily agree with the upper end of that, but they were all decent games. It just comes down to whether they're your particular type of game or not, which for me, they weren't necessarily. I only recently discovered Spore during the Budget Publisher Showdown series as well, so that's a game I need to go back to and explore a little bit more in the future.
It's a solid 10. If you've not got all of those 10 games, at least buy some of them because they are all quality.
Indeed. Well, let's move on and see what we think of the Firebird top 10 then. Up at the top with 94%, joint first place, you might say, Brainstorm, Thrust and Slimey's Mine all got 94%. You've then got Arcade Classics, Eyeball 2, Zolix and Train Robbers, they all got 90%. And then at the lower end of this top 10, Raging Beast, Ricochet and Collapse. So what are your thoughts on this top 10?
There's some interesting choices in that top 10 in terms of reviews. There are some that are absolute bona fide classics, so Thrust and Brainstorm would always be in my Firebird budget top 10, no question. But there are one or two which I feel are overrated. But we'll come to that later on. The one that I think might have been even slightly underrated, even at 90%, was Zolix. It's absolutely addictive, and there should be a health warning on that game because you will end up playing it for ages.
Yeah, you're right. Super addictive game. There's actually 5 games in this list that were in my top 10 Firebird games that I did at the end of my Silverbird selection series. Brainstorm, Thrust, Zolix, Ricochet and Collapse. Collapse I rated highest, and funnily enough it's at the bottom of this top 10, but that's okay. 85% is a fair score. It's not the best looking game, but I do like the playability side of it. For me, the one big standout I would say is Eyeball 2, which is not a bad game. Certainly I enjoy it more than the first one, but I still think 90% is a very generous score for that. Also possibly Slimey's Mine I wouldn't quite rate at the 94%. I'd probably put it sort of mid-70s personally. And Train Robbers.
Yeah, I mean we did cover that in episode 4 of the Budget Publisher Showdown in some detail. And the frustration level, I think as Matt Allen said in episode 1, the phrase wall denter, that game is wall denter territory right there.
Absolutely. You'll recall that that's the only game I ever uttered any expletives about in the whole series. So that says it all, really. So I feel that's overrated as well. Definitely a great idea, but the difficulty level is just so infuriating on it. So finally, let's take a look at Codemasters' top 10 games according to Zzap 64. And no huge surprise to find CJ's Elephant Antics up at the top, along with Super Seymour Saves the Planet, which also got 94%. We've then got 2 games with 91%, Spike in Transylvania and Stuntman Seymour. Steg the Slug has got 87, Murray Mouse Super Cop, Ollie and Lisa 3, they both got 84. Big Nose's American Adventure's got 83%, as has BMX Simulator and Magic Land Dizzy, rounding out this top 10. I must admit I've not played many of these games. In fact, I've only played 5 of them, which is CJ's Elephant Antics, Super Seymour, Steg the Slug, BMX Simulator and Magic Land Dizzy. And I'm not sure Steg the Slug's quite worthy of that 87%. I think I found it a bit boring, although I do think it's really nicely designed. It looks great, sounds great, it's nice and cute, but I did find it a bit tedious, so I probably wouldn't have given that 87%. And also BMX Simulator, as you'll recall when we were talking about it back in episode 4, I wasn't a huge fan of either. I think I'd probably give that maybe somewhere in the 70s. So those are the only 2 really that stand out as being out of place in this particular list.
Siege's Antics I'm a big fan of, so I'm quite glad to see that up there. And one of the other games by Genesis, Spike and Transylvania, is also really worthy as well. It was nice to actually see an arcade adventure type game, not in the Dizzy mold, not as a Spectrum port, but actually using the 64 properly. So for me, Spike and Transylvania has always been good fun, and it still remains it to this day, to be fair. Steg the Slug, I don't mind it. It's quite nice. Some of the other games as well are a bit arcade adventurous. Magicland Dizzy is amongst one of the best Dizzy games, so I can kind of see why that was highly rated. There is one game in there which is hugely overrated, and again, we will come to that in some further discussion. But there's a solid list of 10 games there. I own all but one of them currently, and they are all pretty decent. And a lot of them, I should add, are later Codemasters releases as well. There's only really a BMX Simulator that was kind of from the early Codemasters era.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say some of the developers that they used towards the end of the Commodore 64 gaming era really got some good stuff out of the C64. Obviously, CJ's Elephant Antics and Super Seymour, very nice, colourful games. I know I've been critical of CJ's gameplay to some extent, but I can't deny that it was a good budget game back then, even if in retrospect it's a bit full of spikes. But overall, I think it's a pretty good list from the ones I've played, certainly.
I'd also say as well that if you want an example of how not to design a sequel, then go and play CJ in the USA. And if you've not played it, watch Matt's review, because it is death by spikes. It's game design spoilt to the nth degree. It really is. And it's an absolute crying shame, because the concept of having him in the USA, going around various parts of America, the design's there, but the playability, someone should have just tested it properly.
Yeah, feel free to go and watch my video that I did a few weeks ago. It is a very frustrating game and just dull, really. That's the main thing. It's just a chore to play, going up and down and through mazes and trying to avoid spikes and all that stuff. So frustrating game for sure, and definitely paints the original in a much better light for me. Okay, so that's the top 10 for each publisher. Now you know what's coming next is the worst 10. Same idea, these are the 10 lowest rated according to Zzap's ratings, and there's some real shocking games in these lists. So let's look at Mastertronic first. And the worst game with 8% is Strike, which was a 10-pin bowling simulation. Also in this bottom 10 is Rogue, Speed Zone, Vector Ball, Video Poker, Conquest, Super Trolley, Colony, Ninja, and On Cue. So any of these stand out as being a bit out of place?
The only one that I would probably not put in the bottom 10 is Ninja. Yeah, it's not the best game, but as we covered in episode 4, it's not the worst, and at least there is a bit of playability in it. I wouldn't be giving it massively high amounts, but 25% to me seemed a bit harsh. But looking at the rest of those, there are some absolute howlers in there. One or two I bought at the time and regretted buying. On Cue, I think, was the case in point. Oh, it's trying with Snooker and Pool, but let's just make it so slow and unwieldy and unplayable. Speed Zone is really awful, and Strike is full of bugs. So yeah, I'd only really sort of escalate Ninja out of that lot. The rest deserve to be there, and they are dreadful.
Yeah, agreed. I remember playing almost all of these. There is one Bulldog game which I didn't play, which is Colony. All the others I played back when I was doing the Mastertronic Chronicles, and some of these definitely featured in my worst 10 games. Strike and Speed Zone were two of those. Speed Zone, just an awful Space Invaders style shooter. It's just absolutely dreadful. And Strike, as I recall, you basically just almost always drop the ball on your foot, so you can't even bowl. And then if you get a spare or a strike in the last frame, it just goes on forever and never ends. So as you say, got some bugs in it. Vector Ball, I remember being awful as well. Video Poker, all those sort of gambling games, fruit machines, horse racing, things like that. I just don't see the point of them. It's like, if you're not actually winning any money, there's not really much fun to have out of the game winning virtual money. Super Trolley, for those that haven't seen that, it's the one that came from a kid going on to Jim Will Fix It with He Who Should Not Be Named, asking for a video game to be created. And less said about that, the better, I suppose. So like you, Ninja's probably the one that stands out as least deserving of a space in the worst 10. And the other one that stands out to me is Rogue, which I absolutely hated. But it's not too bad. It's a copy of Rogue. It's a procedurally generated Dungeons and Dragons adventure game style thing. It's not amazing, but 10% is a pretty low score. It's perfectly playable. I don't think it's got any major bugs in it. It may not be your kind of game, and it might seem a bit dated by the time it was released, but 10% seems quite harsh for that game.
Yeah, I mean, there are some other Mastertronic howlers just below this that we could have had in this worst 10, but yeah, this is kind of why, in a way, that some people gave the alternate name of Mastertronic, maybe unfairly, considering that when you had developers like Mr. Chip and others who produced good games for the price, they were often outweighed by some of the absolute carnage that some of those games were. So it was always, I think somebody called it budget roulette, where you would basically not necessarily see the review before buying the game, and you couldn't go, well, I'll go for this one and see what it's like.
Yeah, it's probably worth noting that a lot of the early games wouldn't have been reviewed by Zzap. Those 1984 releases, a lot of which were really bad, all those early Darling Brothers Games Creator games and terrible games like the Election game, they would never have been reviewed by Zzap, so that's why they don't feature in this list. But if they had been, I suspect this worst 10 for Mastertronic would have looked a little bit different. Well, let's move on to Firebird's worst 10, and joint worst place, I suppose you could say, is Blip Video Classics and European 5-a-side. We've then got Booty, Mr. Wino, UFO, Paceman Pat, Beach Buggy Simulator, Caverns of Ereban, Circus Circus, and one of your favourites was Ninja Master.
Oh, joy. I was actually surprised that Zzap gave it 28%, to be perfectly honest, but there you go. Interestingly, out of those 10 worst, 5 of them are Silverbird.
Yeah.
So that shows that the quality control when it came to Silverbird was not as it should be.
Yeah, I did make that comment when I did my worst 10 games for the Silverbird selection. As you say, the quality really did drop when they moved to that packaging style, and not just the games, but also the quality of the packaging as well.
Yeah, it was almost like they were trying too hard to be on the cheap. I mean, looking at these 10, Mr. Wino is not very good as a sort of platforming game. Beach Buggy Simulator is just dull. There's no other word for it. European 5-a-side, yeah, it's not really a good football game either. There's a lot in there that aren't very good.
Yeah.
Ninja Master should have a decimal point between the 2 and the 8 in terms of the percentage. 2.8% might be a bit more appropriate, but there we go.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's shocking that I actually got a higher score than Ninja. Mastertronic's Ninja got 25%, Ninja Master got 28%. I mean, in no world is that fair. From my perspective, there's a few that stand out on this list. Firstly, there's plenty that I agree with, because the likes of Booty and Paceman Pat are really bad. Those were in my worst 10. Beach Buggy Simulator, which was the first game I reviewed in the Silverbird selection, it's a pretty bad Moon Patrol clone, basically. I'm not sure it's 21% bad. Mr. Wino, again, it's hard, and that's probably why they didn't like it. It's not an amazing game by any means, but still seems a little bit low to me, 17%. And UFO, it's a boring game, but 19% is pretty bad when you look at the things that surrounded it. I mean, it's playable, it's just not really any fun to play. But yeah, the one that stands out really for me as being quite unfair is Caverns of Ereban, which, again, is a very hard game, but it's quite a nice little game, you know, kind of flying through the caverns, landing on platforms, collecting fuel pods or something like that. I can't remember exactly what you did in it, but I certainly didn't think it was awful. I'd probably give that around 50 to 60%. 25% seems quite harsh for that. It was a reasonably well programmed game, even if it was really difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it's not terrible. I'd probably say maybe reverse the 2 and the 5, give it 52. Might be kind of a bit more like it, but there are some terrible games in that list, which goes to show that the inconsistency. You know, you could pay $1.99 and have Brainstorm and Thrust, and you'd be well happy with either of those. And Warhawk, I mean, Warhawk got 80%. I need to mention that because that should have got higher in my view, and it's not one that I'm going to talk about later either, but Warhawk, 80%, come on. So, you know, there was always the mix of the good and the bad across all 3 publishers, and the bottom 10 here just proves it.
Yeah, and we're going to get on to where we think Zzap got it really wrong in due course. But before we do that, let's take a look at Codemasters' worst 10. And at the top of the list for this, or the bottom if you prefer, is Armadillo with 14%, followed by Fruit Machine Simulator with 18%, Super Stuntman with 21%, and then going through the list, we've got Super G-Man, Captain Dynamo, Laser Force, Striker in the Crypt of Trogan, Vampire, Ghost Hunters, and Red Max. Interesting to note that Codemasters' 10th worst game has got 36%, which is a hell of a lot higher than either Mastertronic or Firebird. So they did generally seem to rate Codemasters a little bit higher. We'll see whether that has any influence on the overall ranking for them as we move into the later parts of this video. But I haven't actually played hardly any of these. The only one I've played, I think, is Laser Force. So I don't really have much of an opinion on this collection of seemingly terrible games. How about you?
I have all but one of these, and most of these ratings are fairly justified, apart from 1 or 2. Armadillo is fairly derivative, maybe not 14% derivative, but it is pretty dull. Fruit Machine Simulator, it's a fruit machine game. There's not really that much you can dress up with that one, unfortunately. Super G-Man, I probably wouldn't have given it 23% though. I mean, it's a nice little sort of horizontal game with a bit of gravity thrown in. That game was originally on the C16 and Plus 4 called G-Man, and then they kind of souped it up and made it Super G-Man for the Spectrum and 64. And the C16 version of the original G-Man is a really decent little game, actually. Ghost Hunters was a nice and innovative idea with a sort of, crosshair to try and shoot stuff as you move around the platforms. It's better played where the Oliver twins originally designed it, and that means I want to play it on Amstrad, let's be perfectly honest. And Red Max, one of the Codemasters launch titles, and just like last V8, just as hard. They may have fixed the controls, but it's just stupidly hard, and it loses out a lot for it. Plus the fact that the actual screen display is only about a third of the screen at the top. So, if anything, I think Zzap were too generous with Red Max. I probably would have given it lower, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why I've avoided a lot of these games, because they just don't look very good anyway. I know perfectly well that Red Max is very similar to the last V8, and so I would avoid that like the plague. Lots of sort of platform adventure style games here as well, those kind of things that don't really appeal to me that much, but possibly Super G-Man is something I might give a go at some point, but otherwise I can't really see anything, certainly based on the scores that they're getting, that I would think is worth a go.
Captain Dynamo, the problem with that game is there's a bit at the start of the first level. You're bouncing the character around pinball style trying to get out of these platforms. The problem is no one play tested it. So the sad thing is you get beyond that and it's a nice little platformer to get up and up and up to the top and dodging various enemies and actually using various objects and almost do like a sort of hand glide type thing to get across platforms. There are some redeeming features in that game. The problem is because no one play tested it and it was shot down in the Zzap review because of it, you literally couldn't get past the first section. And it's an absolute crying shame because had they paid attention to that, the game would have been a lot more playable and people wouldn't have been as frustrated.
Yeah, which I think a lot of these games are guilty of. You only have to play them for a few minutes to know that nobody else had bothered doing that before they got released. Okay, well, let's move on then to the next section of this episode, which you've alluded to already. So we're going to be talking about when Zzap got it wrong. So we're going to each pick a review of one game from each publisher and say where we think they overrated or underrated it. So we're going to start with where they overrated things. So yeah, we're going to look at the reviews in a little bit more detail. So Waz, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I'm going to kick off with the Mastertronic choice that I think is overrated, and that's One Man and His Droid. Now, some of you may be surprised at this because it's a perfectly playable little game. There is a really good Rob Hubbard soundtrack, but here's the problem with it. For me, it's basically a robot version of the 80s UK TV series One Man and His Dog. You are shepherding robots to a place. The Ramboids, as they're called, they're quite dim. They sort of always move a certain way. And if they're blocked, you've got to make sure you unblock them. For the first 2 or 3 levels, it's quite nice, and you get to play it and you get to find out where they all are. But after that, it just seems like more screens of the same. There's no kind of like new things that get introduced into the levels. You know, you can get the utility modes as well, where you can dig the tunnels and that, and there is some variation, but I just think it was overrated because it just got a bit dull after a while. Presentation, I'd probably say, was a few % higher. The graphics are a bit chunky, probably say the same. The sound is good. It's a good Hubbard soundtrack, I'm not denying that. I'd probably drop the Huckability, Lastability, Value for Money, and I would have probably given it in the mid-60s rather than 81. I know that there were some users on Lemon that didn't think much of it, and actually the author of the original Spectrum version, Clive Brooker, did try to explain some of the sort of reasoning behind the game design, which is very good of him, to be fair, but just not necessarily the game for me. This was a classic case of you could just buy it for the Rob Hubbard soundtrack and be happy with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a brilliant Rob Hubbard soundtrack. I did a video back when I was doing the Mastertronic Chronicles of the best music from Mastertronic games, and this was number 1. It's a fantastic tune, which was also used on Invader Load, of course. But yeah, I tend to agree with you. It's quite a dull game. It's not a very nice looking game either because it's just Spectrum graphics, which, as we know, those high-res Spectrum graphics don't translate to the C64 particularly well generally. So yeah, I think 81%'s too high for it for sure. I agree. When you think games like Pod and Kickstart just got a few % more than that, it doesn't sit right, does it?
Yeah, that's the thing. If you look at the other reviews and you say, well, Pod gets 84, Kickstart 2 gets 86, and that gets 81, you've got to start thinking, hang on a minute. But, I suppose at the time as well, obviously, One Man and a little bit earlier, Zzap review, because it wasn't issue 11, so it was March 86. So you can kind of see where they were coming from with it, but looking back, probably overrated.
Yeah, the interesting one that stands out for me is where they say value for money 87%. Not their best, but still well worthy of a higher price. That's very contradictory. Like, it's not the best game, but we'd still pay more for it. Okay? Bizarre.
Yeah, absolutely bizarre.
I'll pick one now then, and I'm going to go with the Codemasters pick for starters. Pro Skateboard Simulator, which we've obviously discussed at some length in the episode that you were in episode 4. This was given 79% by Zzap, who said, one of Codemasters' best simulators yet, but probably more suited to the more accomplished games player. Well, I definitely agree with that. But what gets me about this, and my big issue with it, is the difficulty level. The time limit is just too short. After the first couple of stages, it, for me, was almost impossible to complete in time. What I've noticed about this review, first of all, is even the screenshot has got a thing saying out of time on it. It's like, so you basically snapped a screenshot of the game over screen, which was a bit of a strange decision. They give it quite a high rating, but then they do criticise it about it being really hard. They're saying high difficulty level makes any progress beyond the second level rather frustrating. Well, that's not a good game then, really, is it? If you can't get past the second level, it's not a 79% game to me. They're saying it's nicely presented, it looks a little bit like 720, it's got the isometric perspective on the first stage. They're all fair comments. It's a typical Codemasters game for me. It looks nice, but it's just a little bit too hard, and as a result, it's quite frustrating. I just think they overrated that. I'd probably give it 60% based on it being too difficult.
Yeah, I do see where you're coming from with that, and to be fair to that, they did actually at least acknowledge it was for the more accomplished games player. It is difficult. I'm not going to argue with that one. This would have probably benefited from something similar in the Codemasters Plus range, where they had standard and expert versions of the game. Maybe what they could have done with this was, and we discussed this as well, was have a difficulty level where the easier difficulty level you had more time or maybe less flags to collect, and then you could progress to the harder levels, and maybe for the harder difficulty you get more points. For me, I still enjoy it, but yeah, I can fully understand, Matt, why you would see this as an overrated game, and I think anyone else who played it and got frustrated will probably agree with you.
Yeah, you're right. If they'd put difficulty levels in, it would have made it so much better. But there you go. I guess it's that thing of the playtester is the developer of the game, and they are so good at it that they don't know that it's too hard for everyone else, which we've mentioned on previous episodes numerous times. So let's move on to another game then. What's your next pick?
So I'm going to pick the Firebird one next, and I'm going to go for Arcade Classics. Basically, Arcade Classics is obviously arcade games from back in the day. And admittedly, it's $1.99. You've got a nice presentation where you can pick the arcade machines. You have a really good Rob Hubbard soundtrack with electric guitar and organ and stuff involved. That's great. But at the end of the day, it's old games just regurgitated into a budget package. For me, not silver medal, nowhere near. I'd still give it a decent rating. Don't get me wrong, I'm not going to say it's terrible, but when you think about other regurgitated games based on old themes that were out there for budget, Blip Video Classics, which came out later on, might be the case in point. You've got to think, well, I could just go and play the original arcade games, or I could dig out my Atari 2600 and play them, for example. There's a method to me that here, this is a classic case of presentation over actual content. It's still playable. I'd probably drop it to about 70%. And is it another game where they got overexcited by the Rob Hubbard music and rated it higher because of that? Possibly. But yeah, it's decent, but no way 90% decent.
Yeah, I agree again. You look at some of the individual scores they've given that. Graphics 74%, fairly basic, but so are the originals. Well, are they basic or not? They are basic graphics, so they're 50%. You can say so are the originals, but you can't give them 74% if you think they're basic. The sound rating, perfectly fine. It is a good Rob Hubbard tune again. Hookability, 93%. Okay, there's a couple of classic games in there, Space Invaders and Asteroids. The other two, Snake and Space Wars, not really what you'd call classics anyway. Space Wars is 2-player only, so that's limited to, you can only play it when your mate comes round. So yeah, it's good, but it's not that good. By this point as well, this is around the same sort of time that the likes of Kickstart 2 and Pod were being reviewed in the magazine, and to give it a higher score than either of those games, we're probably going to say this a lot, it's just wrong.
Sacrilege.
Indeed. I'll move on to my next choice then, and I will also go for the Firebird one this time. I'm going with Silu, which was my worst rated game of all the Firebird games. Now, the review here from Zzap is from when it was released as a £2.50 game, so this is the earlier packaging from Firebird with the big screenshot on the front. But this game is awful. I mean, it's awful in every way. The graphics are terrible, Spectrum-y style graphics. Everything on the screen is one colour. It only takes up half the screen, and the rest of it's like a status bar thing. It's really hard to even see where your character is amongst all the other obstacles, and you're forever running out of fuel, so you're constantly dashing around these isometric screens. And yes, it is an isometric game, which I'm not a fan of. The sounds are terrible as well. Just the fact you've got to continually top up your energy when it's supposed to be an adventure exploration game, it just makes no sense. And you look at the Zzap review and they gave it 65%, saying it's just above average. They gave it a value for money score at 72%, but then said even at 250 it's not too hot. That's a bit contradictory straight away. Graphics, they gave 69%. Nice 3D attempt, but everything's the same colour. This is one of the most contradictory reviews they ever did, I think. If you look at some of the comments, none of them are very impressed by it. All the 3 reviewers, they're all saying, I didn't like it that much. A lot of gameplay elements have gone missing. They're saying lots of bad things about it, but then they still gave it a score of 65%, which is about the sort of threshold where you start considering whether to buy a game or not. So to me, it's a complete contradiction. It's a terrible game, and yet they gave it, a pretty good rating, I would say. It's just bizarre.
I've got to agree completely, Matt. This game is hugely overrated in Zzap, to say the least. The hookability even says that Silo's too dependent on power. Well, surely if you said that, that's an immediate disqualification for being a hookability game, right?
Yeah.
The thing is, what they could have done with the design was made it so you didn't have to depend so much on the power. So you weren't backtracking all the time to try and get all of the extra energy all the time. The sad thing is, so much more could have been done. The basics are there, but it just doesn't really work. I mean, you look at the ratings. I mean, graphics are too high. I can see what they were trying to do with the 3D. I kind of get that, but it doesn't quite work. Sound is rubbish, so that should be dropped a fair bit. Lastability, who said it was rather dull, and they gave it 68%.
Yeah,
if it's dull, the lastability should have been about 6%, surely.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, 65% for this is an insult. I would be quite happily dropping this to at least 30 or 25 if I was feeling generous.
Just reading through Julian Rignall's comment here. The game may have heaps of screens, but each room is really small, taking up less than half the space of the Commodore screen. The game itself is very hard, the control fiddly, and having to keep powering up Silo every few minutes was a real pain. There's no positives there at all. There's not a single positive thing, and yet somehow it got 65%.
And it also concludes with, I suppose it's another cartographer's delight, but not one I'd really recommend, even at its cheap price. So if he doesn't rate it that much, surely they should have been hands over the head love, like, oh no, this game is terrible. I really do not know what they were thinking with this review. I mean, I'm glad you picked that one, because I was already considering that, but I knew that because you'd rated Silu so lowly that you'd pick that. But yeah, it's terrible. It really is. I could even argue by saying this is even worse than Ninja Master, and for me that would be saying something.
Indeed, absolutely, and I would agree. Okay, well, let's move on then to your final one.
So for the overrated selection from Codemasters, I'm going to go for Murray Mouse Super Cop, which was a quite late release. It was 1992, to be precise. Zzap gave this a way too generous 84%. And there's a number of reasons why I don't rate this highly. I can see graphically that they were trying to aim this at the younger market. So the cartoony style graphics that they've ported over from the Spectrum do seem quite colourful and nicely high-res drawn background. I kind of get that. The hero Murray Mouse is quite nice, but it just seems like it's a lazy port from the Spectrum version. Some of the graphics just seem like they've got squares round, and the screenshot in Zzap actually had these mushrooms, and they look like they've got squares round the actual mushrooms themselves, rather than take advantage of having a decent background in there. As an arcade adventure type game in the Dizzy mold, it's not bad. There are some brain teasers which aren't that difficult, that's fine. The music by Alistair Brimble is pretty nice. but it is a little bit short. But there are other arcade adventures that Codemasters released which are better than this. Spike in Transylvania being a case in point, and that only got 7% more than this, which is an absolute crime. You know, the game is perfectly playable, puzzles are nice, it does suffer a little bit from that double jumping occasionally, although nowhere near as bad as Wild West Seymour. I mean, basically, experienced arcade adventurers, they will probably get through it reasonably quickly. There is some appeal to it, maybe for the younger gamer, but would I give it 84%? No. I'd be looking at late 50s, early 60s from this.
I'm not familiar with this one at all, but it doesn't look good from the screenshots. And in 1992, as you mentioned when we were talking about Wild West Seymour when we did episode 4, a bad Spectrum port just isn't going to cut it. And I notice it says on one of the reviews there, the review by Phil, in the green box at the end, he says, "I'm sure we haven't seen the last of this Mighty Mouse." I bet we did. But was there another Murray Mouse game?
No, there was not. This
No,
was the
funny
only
that.
one. Interesting as well, the title screen of the game actually says it was called Mice Mania. So where the Murray Mouse Super Cop thing came from, I have no idea.
Yeah, it doesn't really look like he's doing super cop things in a field full of mushrooms and a sewer or whatever that is in the other screenshot.
Yeah, it is quite a collectible release though, because it is a late Codemasters release. I didn't pay that much for mine, thankfully, but I do know that this gets a reasonably decent price out there. Interestingly, it was also one of the games that was on that EDOS system that you may remember from W.H. Smith and John Menzies, where you'd basically have a tape mastering machine that would master the tape for it.
Oh yeah.
And I've seen some copies for sale on eBay that are actually the EDOS release of this. But yeah, it's okay, but it just seems like it was another excuse for a lazy port rather than taking advantage of maybe having nicer graphics and making it a little bit more appealing.
Yeah, Codemasters, well renowned for those flick screen arcade adventures, and Commodore 64 generally got short shrift for them being lazy Spectrum ports, unfortunately.
And it's a shame because actually underneath all of that, the games themselves as sort of puzzles to solve are pretty playable.
Okay, well, let's move on to my final pick, which is a Mastertronic game, and you're going to get a sense of deja vu here as I talk about Molecule Man, which Zzap gave a score of 69% in February 1987, and basically just everything I said about Silu applies to this game as well. It's got Spectrum-y graphics, it's isometric perspective, and again, you have to keep collecting some kind of energy or time or something, I can't remember exactly what it is now, to keep going as you're exploring, so it's got exactly the same flaws as Silu. It's not quite as bad looking as Silu. The graphics are marginally better. The main character sprite's quite cute. It's got very basic sound effects again. But yeah, it's almost a carbon copy review in a way, in that they've given pretty high ratings. But then when they're talking about the game, well, one person likes it, to be fair. He's got the thumbs up. Well, Gary Penn on the right here of this review says, "I found Molecule Man slow, tiresome and quite frustrating. Too much tedious exploration involved. Single-coloured graphics are dull and repetitive, but it's still cheap and worth a second look unless you feel the same way as him." It's like, well, make your mind up, man. You know, have some convictions. So yeah, we've got a little bit of a variance of opinion. And I suppose this shows where sometimes the three different reviewers would disagree, and so they'd give it a rating that was kind of average. But I just feel exactly the same way about this game as I do about Silu. It's just a terrible isometric adventure game which doesn't encourage you to explore because you're constantly having to top up energy or time or whatever it is. 200 locations to explore, and it's also got its own maze designer, but you'll never see those 200 locations because you're constantly trying to top up your health bar or what. I really should have remembered what this was.
It's the radiation pills, isn't it? So
yeah, that's it.
It's a similar mechanic to Silu where you've got to go and find stuff to keep your energy going. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the faults in Silu can apply to here. There are some at least sort of features, the fact that you can actually get a little bit further. It doesn't seem as harsh, I would say, as Silu in terms of the fact that although you've got to collect the radiation pills, you've not got to be as quick and as desperate to do it, for example. So that's not too bad. The screen designer probably rescues it from being absolutely terrible because at least you can make up your own maze instead and you can save it to tape for later sessions. So, you know, to be fair, that is a nice touch and at least you've got that as an extra sort of feature you can include. But it doesn't, for me, play as well as it should do. Feels a little bit slow as well.
Yeah, very slow.
Which is a shame, because the premise is there. Again, playability needs tweaking a bit. I would say a few of those sort of ratings that they gave it, I'd probably drop it by about 20%-ish at least. The screen designer, to be fair, is actually pretty usable. So actually for the presentation, they've probably got that about right, because having a nice screen designer in longevity is not a bad feature. although it says the graphics move quite quickly compared to other games of this ilk, it does to a degree, but then when there's loads of stuff on screen, it does still suffer from that slowdown a bit. It's not the worst game ever, but it's not brilliant. And actually, I've got the C16 and Plus 4 version of this, and that seems like it uses the hardware better than the 64 version. Granted, no screen designer, but as an actual game, it feels more playable.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel that the budget companies never put out a good one of these isometric adventure games. The developers of them missed what the point of these games was, which was the exploration, the finding objects and using them and combining them and solving puzzles. And to be fair, I dissed Chimera a bit, but you do get that in Chimera. Again, you've still got the problem of losing health really quickly, but it's not quite as bad as these two games. But yeah, they're all trying to tap into the success of the Ultimate games, Night Law and Alien 8, and they just didn't come close. And I'm not a fan of those games because I don't like games in isometric perspective, but I will recognise that they're good games. But these budget versions of them just really pale in comparison. It's not as bad as Silu, but it's not far off. I'd say Silu's like a 20% game, and this is maybe 35 or something like that. I think I put it in my worst 10 Mastertronic games list, so I obviously wasn't very impressed with it at the time.
I think it's worth pointing out as well that if you want a decent sort of isometric view game on the 64, then actually the 64 conversion of Head Over Heels is actually really good, to be fair. It's a really good conversion. And what that proved was, given the right programmers, you could actually do decent isometrics on the 64. And that game stands up well across all the 8-bit formats. I'd probably say if you're going to play Head Over Heels in any format, if you had them all, play it on the Amstrad. It's probably the best of the lot. But the 64 version is still very, very good.
Yeah, I used to play the 64 version when I was a kid. I got no problem with that. That is a good isometric adventure game. So just to go on record, they do exist and I do like a few of them, but just none of the ones I've ever reviewed on my channel is basically what it comes down to.
Yeah, if you ever were trying to do a series on the Hit Squad, then you could revisit all those old games, but let's face it, who's going to want to collect Hit Squad games at the moment? That's just ludicrous.
Yeah, not me.
No, not me either.
But Head Over Heels does appear on a compilation, so maybe I'll come to that at some point. Okay, well, that was overrated games. Let's move on to when Zzap got it wrong, but we think they underrated games. So I will go first on this one, and I'm going to start with a game that I put in my top 10 Mastertronic games, and Zzap rated it 32%. So I obviously don't agree with this. It's Bomb Fusion. This is a single-screen platformer that combines Bomb Jack and Flicky. You have to collect the bombs and take them to a thing to defuse them, I suppose, and you also have to touch bombs around the screen to defuse them as well. Is it a brilliant game? No, but I like it. It's arcade style, it's playable. The graphics are not great. They're obviously ported over from the Spectrum. They could be better, but they're not terrible. It's got a nice tune on it. Yeah, I just don't think Zzap got this one right at all. And they said it's dead boring. All the levels look very similar, with small bland sprites and platforms depicting the repetitive action. The only way the levels get harder is the increasing number of cells to collect. It is a bit easy, I would say that much. You get through a lot of levels without having to try that hard. I've not played it for a while, but I remember enjoying it a lot, and as I said, it went somewhere in my top 10 Mastertronic games, so it certainly had an impact on me at the time. The cover art for it is absolutely abysmal, but the game itself, quite nice. I'd probably give it somewhere around 80% or something like that.
Yeah, I've played this a while ago, and there's a lot to commend about this game, actually. I mean, it's basically nice and straightforward arcade action. Defuse the bombs, get the cells, put them in the boxes, and the level is done. But you've got different level designs for the platforms, you've got pretty frenetic action in later levels, and it's a playable little game. It's not 32% rated at all. It should be pointed out at this point that some of the Zzap reviews only had an overall score. They didn't go into full detail. They were part of their core blimey, the budget bit that they used to have in some of the later issues. So it was a very kind of quick 100-word review. I would probably give it at least mid-60s to late 60s, maybe not as high as the 80, but it is definitely a playable game.
Yeah, it's worth £2 of anybody's money, even though they said it's a poor release even at £2. I have got a soft spot for single-screen arcade platformers. A lot of my favourite games are those, so I'd probably rate it higher than some people would, but 32% is just rude, frankly. So how about you? What's your first pick for underrated?
Okay, so I'm going to pick the Codemasters game first, and I'm going to go for Tilt, which got 74% in the November 1990 issue of Zzap. 74% for a game that's got innovative 3D, is really addictive, really good fun, and really shows that the programmer knew what he was doing. it's too low. I mean, the programmer Stephen Walters had a pinball game before this called 3D Pinball, which was released by Mastertronic, and that had a really nice perspective of playing pinball. And you could tell that he was a decent coder because of the way that he'd got the sort of table with all the bumpers and flippers moving in a pseudo 3D effect. Really nice. Tilt has that in abundance, and it's basically one of those like sort of sliding table games where you have to move the table to direct the ball. When you get through the first few stages, the ball gets increased in size. You've also got these motion censored lights you've got to stop on and then move off in the right time. So it becomes a real addictive test of nerve as well, because you've really got to be on it all the way through. But the controls are spot on. The controls really let you play the game properly. It's really original and playable. The way that also as well that it rotates the maze off and brings the next one on at the end of the level. That's lovely. It's a really nice little touch to the game. Commodore Format reviewed it in their first issue, and they had the character Roger Frames reviews Budget Games, and they gave it a fairly high rating, which is why the Roger Frames character appears on the front cover art of the game. 74% for me, no. It should have been mid to late 80s at least, and maybe even 90%. It's original, it's addictive, it's fun.
Yeah, and they even say most of that stuff in the review. You know, they say it's an original playable game, technically very impressive, which it is. It's very impressive technically. Solid 3D maze moves quickly and smoothly. So again, the score doesn't really reflect the comments that they're making. They don't really say anything negative about it, and yet they seem to knock quite a bit off. I mean, I know it's not the same kind of game at all, but they've got Barbarian 2 right next to it. The Kicks re-release, and they gave that 78%. It's way more fun than Barbarian 2.
Yeah, I've got to agree with that. I mean, if I was saying that full price games were overrated, I'd be going Barbarian 2. 96% gold medal on original release. Nah, not having that.
Well, let's move on, because I obviously spoke about Tilt quite a lot in the final episode of the original series, so I don't need to say any more about that. So let's move on to my next pick, and I'm going to go Codemasters this time, and Laser Force, which was in their worst 10 games, as we looked at earlier. They gave us 32%, only a very small review, but they're basically saying it's derivative and not really any fun and really easy. It's not an amazing game, this. I'd probably give it like 60 to 70%. The graphics are really nice. It's got variety because you've got a scrolling shooter, you've got a centipede style game, you've got a Mooncrest, a refueling stage, and then a kind of scrolling avoid the obstacles kind of thing as well, going through a cave. So plenty of variety. It's nicely programmed. It's got some pretty decent music on the title screen. It's a decent budget game for £2. I think 32% was just similar to what they gave to Bomb Fusion, just really stingy, I thought.
I've got to agree, Matt. This is one of the early Gavin Rayburn games that he brought out via Codemasters, and I enjoy this. The 4 individual little stages go quite nicely, and obviously once you've got past the 4th stage, they loop in more difficulty. There's some nice effects on the vertical scrolling section that remind you of kind of the fire effects in Salamander and the arcade game. You know, it moves at a good pace. That you've got a little centipede kind of bit in the second stage, and then, as you said, you've got the nice little refueling, and then you can sort of head up the vertical scrolling road and dodge everything, but it's just really, really nice. I think the review kind of like gave it a bit of a hard time because they said it was too easy, but sometimes you don't want a mega difficult game. You want to be able to sort of go through a few goes of it and get more frenetic as it goes later on. But I'd have no hesitation in giving this about 60% easily. It's a really nice little playable game, and actually showed what Gavin would later do with Poltergeist as well.
Yeah, we're in agreement, as we have been with most of these. I don't even think it's that easy. I think the first wave of 4 levels is pretty easy, although you nearly always lose a life on the centipede one, so it's not that easy. And by the time you get to the 3rd time around, it's pretty hard. You know, you'll have lost some lives by that point. So yeah, I mean, they probably were better game players than I am back then, because that was their job, I suppose. But the graphical effects, like you say, the fire on the first wave, really nice. Yeah, I just don't see any issue with it. For £2, it's a perfectly acceptable budget game.
Yeah, I mean, I happily paid £2 for it back in the day, and even now, you know, it's still a fairly playable little game. There's nothing offensive about it. It's one of the better earlier Codemasters releases as well.
Yeah, for sure. Okie doke. Well, let's move on to your next pick then.
Yeah, so I'm going to go for a Silverbird game this time, and it's going to be Scorpius, which is a horizontally scrolling shoot 'em up coded by Delvin Sorrell, and also notorious for having both John and Steve Rowlands involved prior to the likes of Creatures and Retrograde. It's a really nice little polished shoot 'em up. You know, you get extra weapons in there. It scrolls at a nice rate. There's some nice parallax scrolling in the background. The way that the little main character moves, sort of like sways from side to side as he shoots, it's a really nice little touch. Originally, once you get these sort of ship upgrades, you start moving faster. You really have that kind of freneticism in there. Yeah, maybe there's a little bit of kind of an R-type vibe in that game, but it just works really well. You've got 4 good stages that are quite long and become progressively difficult, but you do feel like you're getting further every time. I really like this game. I really played it quite a lot when I had it back in 1988 when it came out, and it's still, for me, one of the better Silverbird releases by some degree. It takes practice, I grant you, but I would probably say 71% overall is a little harsh. I'd probably give it mid to late 80s-ish, because it is good, and for $1.99 you can't go wrong with a quality budget shooter like this.
Yeah, well, I agree with most of what you said there. Certainly, graphically, it looks the part in particular. It's really nicely done. Great parallax scrolling. Definitely got a bit of an R-Type vibe. Basically, the levels look like the second level of R-Type, very similar to that. There's a couple of things I'm not that much of a fan of. I don't think anything shoots at you very much in it, so the enemies just kind of swarm towards you. And also, the end of level bosses are really disappointing. It's just a tiny little sprite shooting at you. I'd probably disagree with you on this one and say that they got it about right at 71%, I think. Graphics should have got a bit of a higher score than 73%, I think, and lastability a little bit more perhaps as well, because it's only 4 levels, but they are very long levels and fairly challenging. So it's perhaps a little bit underrated in some respects, but I think 71% is about right, I would say. When I played it for the Silverbird series, I did find it a bit boring. The levels are probably too long. If they had several shorter but more varied levels, it probably would have just bumped it up a little bit more for me.
Yeah, and that's fair enough. I think it's more for me that I remember sort of playing it for hours and really getting a lot out of it, which is why I have those fond memories of playing that game.
I did have it when I was a kid as well and enjoyed it as a big R-Type fan back in the day, so yeah, I enjoyed it then. Playing it again now, it's probably lost a little bit of the luster, but I do remember having fun with it when I was a kid, so fair enough. Perhaps back then I might have thought they'd underrated it a little bit. And it's got 2-player mode as well, which not too many shooters on the C64 had, you know, not horizontal scrolling ones anyway, so that's a nice touch. Okay, let's move on then to my final pick, and we've mentioned this already in the worst 10 for Firebird, and that's Video Classics. Zzap gave this 15%. One of the most pointless budget releases ever, they said. All the scores are low. Presentation, 31%. You've got 1 or 2 player mode and a choice of 6 games. Well, that's pretty good presentation, I would have thought. You may not like the games, but having the choice is surely a good thing. Simple sprites and puke-worthy scrolling backgrounds, can't actually argue with that too much, and the sound's not great either. I think my issue with their review of this is, it's very similar in style to the arcade classics that they gave 90% to, and here they're giving basically the same idea, which is a collection of old games, and also quite a unique thing with the Asteroids, where it's Pong and asteroids kind of mixed together, so there is a bit of originality in there. But for some reason, not that long after they reviewed the arcade classics, they're saying, oh, this collection of old video games is really terrible, when previously they were saying this collection of old video games is really great. So it's just a bit strange that they've gone so low with it. Yes, it is just a bunch of Pong clones, but even now people love playing Pong. It's not the greatest game ever made, but it's very influential and fun to play with 2 players, so it's just a bit bizarre really that they gave it such a low score.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand it to a degree in some of the ratings. I mean, the sound is not particularly great. The tune seems a bit like it was kind of hacked from the demo tune out of Ubic's music. But the whole concept of it being a number of Pong games with the various things like you would have on your home Pong console, you'd have like tennis and all that effort, they're all here. And for $1.99, it's not dreadful, and certainly 15% to me seems way too harsh.
Yeah, maybe as a percentage score from Zzap, maybe 50 to 60%. We're not talking a classic by any means, but it's certainly perfectly playable, and especially if you've got a mate to play with, so you've got a bunch of different 2-player classic sort of video sports games to play. It's effectively a retro gaming compilation on a retro computer now, but back then it would have had that nostalgia for people who grew up playing Pong in the late 70s, so it's very harsh to give it 15%, I think.
Notably, for those who do read Zzap, the other review on the same page of where Video Classics is GA+. And one of the reviewers mentioned that Sensible Software did a better job with Galaxy Birds than GAP Plus.
Oh my
What?
God.
What? GAP Plus is an excellent arcade conversion for £1.99. I just want to put that
Yeah.
on record right out there right now because it's great. Commodore User gave it 97%. Maybe that was a bit too high, but as an arcade conversion, and it was only on 64 as well, should add, they got Ash and Dave to put it together, put loads of sprites whizzing across the screen, all the features from the original are there. If we were going to sort of look at underrated games for arcade conversions, I think this review of GAP Plus would have been tearing to pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually going to point that out, that there's another underrated game on the very same page because it is an excellent conversion of a not very well-known arcade game, but that doesn't really matter. It's as playable as the original with some nice graphical effects and sound as well. So just strange.
It is strange. The game is great fun, and if you don't have it, I am sure both Matt and myself can highly recommend that you source a copy of GAP Plus and play it.
Absolutely, we can. Okay, so to round this section off, yours is a Mastertronic one still to go as well, isn't it? So
it is indeed.
Yeah.
I'm going for Night Racer. And there are quite a few people who really like this game, including Chinevision. And one of the earliest Chinevision reviews was of Night Racer. The Zzap review, one of them mentioned the fact that it was basically a single-player version of Pit Stop 2 on a darkened racetrack, and some were basically saying first-person driving games were getting boring. It was almost like the market had been flooded with driving games by the time that they got to review Night Racer, which probably explains why they got a rating of 36% overall. But no, absolutely incorrect. The game is really playable. The 3D effect with the sort of night and the trees and actually the pace that you drive at really does give you a good feeling of speed. Now, bearing in mind that the 64 doesn't have that many great racing games, this is perfectly fast and playable. You've got to try and beat the computer opponent, because if you don't, the little display on the bottom left of the dash will then spin round, and obviously if it hits the bottom of the red, that's it, it's game over. The driving is really good, it's a really realistic feel. Obviously they've taken up some of the screen with the dashboard so that the play area is not huge, but it works because actually the play area looks like it's sort of a nice widescreen effect with the driving, so it does kind of work. You've got a little map in the bottom left which shows you where you're going, although it's not that readable, it's got to be said. But you look at the marks for it, 48% for graphics. The nice effects of the trees and the 3D is lovely. I don't know where that came from. The sound, 39%. I quite like the David Dunn title sheet, to be perfectly honest. It's definitely not worth that low. And the last ability, they were probably getting bored of racing games, hence low rating. But Lemon, at the moment, the reviews on that rate 6.3, which is the reverse of 36. And that is probably where I would give this game at least. I'd probably give it 63% around that time. It's not the most outstanding 64 game ever, but as a playable racing game with a good feeling of speed and a nice mission to complete, yeah, check it out. And do check out Chinevision's review, because it's a very fair review and you will see what a non-64 owner originally thinks of it.
Yeah, I agree again. It's definitely underrated by Zzap. It's a perfectly playable, enjoyable driving game. It is challenging. I do feel like this era, particularly when you get sort of 88, 89, they just pretty much dismissed almost every budget game, not really giving it enough play, perhaps focused on bigger games or whatever. But yeah, there's nothing up with it. It's not the best racing game on the system, but it's above average, and yeah, 60 to 70%, it's well worth that. So like you say, perhaps they're just fed up of those kind of games at the time, but it's their job to review things fairly, and it didn't really feel like they did in this occasion.
Yeah, and interestingly as well, Night Racer was one of the games that I did a poke for, and was one of the first appearances in Zzap that I had. So I had a poke where basically the computer opponent in the yellow car would just stay on the line and not move, so you could beat them easily. So that was quite nice to sort of do that and get that published. It's one of my early memories of having a cheat published in Zzap, so that reason will always have a little fond memory of the game. But yeah, the game is still playable. I still own the game now after all these years, so that must tell you something. I still load it up for a quick blast even now.
Yeah, and the fact that you're racing against someone and the game's got to keep track of where they are is actually quite clever from a programming perspective as well, and not something you get in every driving game. So again, just another one where they just got it completely wrong, I think.
Yeah, the programmer of the game, Kevin Green, went on to do International Speedway, or Silverbird.
He did indeed, yeah.
Which is maybe why you can see kind of that split effect of the dash at the bottom and the sort of graphics at the top. Obviously in International Speedway you had the little course map and the other riders along with with the top as well. So you could see the program had a reasonably decent 3D engine, and you could reuse it for the Speedway game.
Yeah, very similar looking game, although I have to say this is a lot better than International Speedway.
I concur completely.
Okay, well, there we go. That's the detailed look at some of the games that we think Zzap got wrong with the reviews, for better or worse. Any others you want to pick out quickly just to round this section off?
Yeah, I mean, there's several where you think, well, the reviews are pretty much spot on. And to be fair, you have to say that the majority of the time, the reviews were pretty decent. In terms of underrated, other ones I'd probably mention, and people are going to say, yes, it's a Sean Southern game, Warren. Yeah, Hero of the Golden Talisman has got to be one of my underrated ones for definite. It's huge. It's a massive arcade adventure. It's a really nice challenge. 78% was maybe a little harsh, but I can also see why, because the graphics and sound weren't maybe the most advanced, even though it's a playable game. I kind of see where they could come from with that. I was also actually quite surprised that you didn't mention Rad Ramp Racer, because I know you're quite a big fan of that one, because that got 33%. So again, I think you would have scored that a lot higher.
Indeed, I would, yes.
Yeah. The only other one that I think that I might have kind of challenged in terms of the rating a bit more would probably be Quick Snacks, because it got 80%. But it's not Quick Snacks. It's a maze game that's an overhead version of Flicky and is a perfectly nice maze game, but it's not Quick Snacks. Even the Oliver twins admitted that they basically saw this maze game and thought, well, that'll do, we'll just bung it out. And that's not very fair in 64 owners. If you play Quick Snacks on, say, Spectrum or Amstrad, it's a completely different and very enjoyable game.
I think you've been preaching at the Cinevision Ultra a little bit too much.
As a standalone game, if it wasn't called Quick Snacks and was called something else, and they didn't shoehorn the Dizzy character in, fair enough, but it's not great.
See, whereas I'd actually say that it might be a little bit underrated, because that's probably my favourite Codemasters game. But there you go. We have to differ on some things, I suppose.
We do. But I think in a way it also shows that every reviewer will see things differently. And actually, this is why having the number of reviewers in Zzap that they did and having that cross-section of ratings at least gave you a more representative view rather than just one person. I'd also probably say the only one that would be a little bit underrated for me is possibly Video Minis. Later Tony Kelly game. That got 71%. I'd maybe give it about 10% more, because it was good fun, it was playable, and it was a nice challenge. And, you know, for a budget game, it was all that you needed, really.
Yeah, I remember enjoying that too, so perhaps right there. I've got a few underrated ones, and there's 3 games that Zzap cruelly gave terrible scores that are in my top 10 Mastertronic games. Rad Ramp Racer's one of them. Street Surfer I've talked enough about in episode 4, so I won't go on too much about that, other than it's a travesty that it was only given 29%. And the other one is a game that you briefly mentioned earlier, 3D Pinball, which Zzap gave 41%. That was the game coded by Stephen Walters, who also did Tilt. And yeah, that's an excellent pinball game with a really good feel of sort of inertia of the ball moving around. It's, again, a really good physics and 3D simulation, just like Tilt was. So yeah, I feel that was harshly rated at 41%. In terms of overrated, Stunt Bike Simulator, the Silverbird game, they gave 40%. Now that might not seem like a very generous score, but it's terrible. I mean, you can't even get off the first stage. It's got literally like 30 seconds of gameplay in it until it's game over and you have to start again. So yeah, that's actually overrated at 40%. And one other underrated one, slightly, I would say, was Slicks, the Codemasters game, which Zzap gave 82%. I mean, that's an excellent top-down view driving game, worthy of the 90% or more score, I would say.
Slicks all day. 90% territory for me as well. I've got to agree with on that, Matt. It is great fun. It's really playable. I'd also probably agree with you on the fact that 3D Pinball is underrated. 41%? Really? It's really nice and playable. In fact, I played it the other day just to sort of see how good it was compared to the Zzap score. And I was like, this is not 41% territory, not a chance. As a budget pinball game, yeah, 3D Pinball is the one to get, folks.
It's a really good pinball simulation. I mean, if you don't like pinball, I guess you'd rate it a little bit lower as a result of that. But if you want a good simulation of pinball on an 8-bit system, I don't think there's anything better that I can think of. Well, that sums up, I think, everything we think that Zzap got wrong. So let's move on to the finale of this episode, which is basically to see, when we average out all the scores from the 3 publishers, who did Zzap think was best and worst? So we're going to see whether they agree with our ratings of Mastertronic being best, Firebird in the middle, and Codemasters worst, or will it be different? So since you did all the hard work on this, I'm going to let you announce the ratings for the three publishers.
Okay, so in terms of all the review percentages averaged out over the number of games that they had reviewed, Mastertronic finished last with 55.28%. Firebird was second with 57.9%, and Codemasters were top of the pile with 61.26%. So the Codies were top. Now, bearing in mind that a lot of the later Codemasters games were probably more favourably reviewed, but also as well the quality did get better over time with budget companies anyway. So those later releases really helped push the average up. If you're looking at the late era of Codemasters, you've got to be looking at Slicks, Spike and Transylvania, CJ's Elephant Antics, and so on. So, there are some really good late releases out there. In terms of the number of games reviewed, there were 78 Mastertronic, 60 Firebird, and 57 Codemasters. So they did give a fair amount of coverage to all three companies.
Yeah, and probably that's why Mastertronic have finished last, because they reviewed almost 20 more games than Firebird. And so obviously some of those weren't going to get the greatest scores, I suppose, because inevitably, as we know, roughly 50% of all budget games from these companies was terrible. So there we go.
Yeah, so if we were to use a threshold that anything 60% or above was classed as a decent budget game, Mastertronic would have 38 in that category, Firebird 32, and Codemasters 33. So they're all pretty close in terms of how many games got above that 6% threshold.
Yeah.
Where Mastertronic fall down, though, is the number of games that scored below 30%, which are the real ones that you want to kind of avoid. Mastertronic had 12 of those, Firebird 11, and Codemasters 5. And obviously that was something we alluded to when we looked at the bottom 10 as well. We could see that a lot of them were just above the 30 range. I mean, this is the perfect description of where, really, as Matt Allen said back in episode 1, budget roulette was really a thing, because you didn't always see all the reviews of the games before you bought them, and you were just basically chancing your arm on what would be a good game. And when you did get something really good, you were like really, really happy with it, because you were thinking, I've paid $1.99 for this, and it's like decent, But I think overall, give credit to Zzap where it's due as well, that at least they reviewed the games that were on budget. They didn't exclude them entirely. I mean, there was a period for about a year or two where they just basically gave them a little single box review and quite a small review at that. And people did kick off at the time because they were saying, well, hang on a minute, if the game's $1.99 and it's decent, why shouldn't it get equal coverage to a game that's $9.99? Because it's still a good game regardless of the price tag.
And also bearing in mind that not everyone could afford those $9.99 games every month, so giving them an option at a lower price probably didn't please the advertisers that much. But in the end, people were buying the magazine because they want to hear about games that they would be interested in going out and buying. So that included budget games. Certainly for me, I was just as interested in, a nice bargain as I was the latest arcade conversion or sports game or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, it's very easy for people to kind of discount them because of the earlier budget titles that maybe weren't great. But as with all software houses, you grow from that. You get good developers working with you to get the good games out there. And, if you look at a lot of the later budget releases across all three companies, they really put out some good stuff.
Sure. Okay, well, just to round things off, I'm going to apply the scores from Zzap to the games that we covered in the original 5 episodes of this series. So the likes of Pod and Trojan Warrior and Hero of the Golden Talisman and European Five-A-Side and BMX Simulator, games like that. I'm going to take the percentages given by Zzap to the games that they reviewed, and it wasn't quite all of them, and we'll average those out and see if that made any difference to which publisher they ranked highest and lowest. So there were 3 games that weren't reviewed for each publisher. Strangely, the run and gun genre, which was Rapid Fire for Mastertronic, Combat Crazy for Firebird, and SAS Combat Simulator for Codemasters. None of those got a review in Zzap, so I guess they just didn't like run and gun games. And there were 2 other games from each publisher that weren't reviewed by Zzap, but that then leaves 13 games reviewed by each, so an even way to stack up the scores. And it came out as Mastertronic in third place with 61%, Firebird in second place with 70%, and Codemasters winning with 72% for the games that we reviewed over the course of the 5 episodes of the series. So it didn't make any difference to the ratings of those games. There were as many duffers as there were good ones in terms of their review scores. But it was pretty close again. Certainly, as we said on previous occasions, there wasn't much between these publishers. They all had a pretty good share of decent games and an almost equal share of bad ones.
Absolutely right. I mean, it's interesting as well that actually some of the reviews in terms of the 3, 2, and 1 points that we would have given those would have stood out. So, for example, driving games in round 3, where all 3 games were reviewed by Zzap, Slicks would have won, and I would have an argument with that at all. But Formula 1 Simulator would have been above International Speedway, which might have been a little bit of controversy. And I'm pleased to see that in the other shooters, Pod won over Trojan Warrior, over Sky High Stuntman, which is actually the rating that myself, you, and Matt Allen all gave.
Yeah, we all agreed on that.
We weren't wrong.
No.
That's kind of reassuring, actually. But the last 3 categories, and obviously we did add in the ratings for the re-releases in this table, all 3 games got 94% by Firebird.
Yeah, I noticed that as well.
That's a level of consistency, and that's probably why they took the final round.
Indeed.
What it shows is that even if you take into account different reviews for the different episodes that we had, it still kind of works out similar to what other magazines rated at the time. So we couldn't have all been wrong, could we?
No. I think generally we got it right for the most part. That 80s Essentials episode that you participated in, Zzap's scores for the games in that round, for the Mastertronic games, really almost seemed like a vendetta. You get like 33% for Rad Ramp Racer, 29 for Street Surfer, 25 for Ninja, and even 63 for Kane was low compared to all the other magazines. They just, I don't know, didn't like those genres of games or something. But yeah, so that's really where Mastertronic have fallen down in this particular view of those games, because they're all bad scores compared to the others. I mean, again, they've rated Ninja lower than Ninja Master, and they didn't give a score to Ninja Massacre, but I think we could assume it would have been probably at least 40 to 50% as a reasonably playable Gauntlet clone. So it's just some very strange, stingy reviews during that period of time.
It kind of proves as well, though, Matt, that you can't please all of the people all the time. We always have to remember that the review is an opinion of the reviewer or reviewers. So not everyone is going to agree, but that's the kind of thing why we're talking about these games now. I think what it proves is that, you know, you looked at the ratings in Zzap, and that probably influenced quite a few people as to what games they would buy. And obviously some may have been avoided because of the low review, where they might have actually missed out on a good game. And ironically, it's actually now some of that worst rated games that didn't get maybe a lot of copies pressed that are quite hard to find.
Yeah, I suppose, you know, ultimately we were influenced by them. We'd buy the games that they recommended, and then we'd, even if they weren't necessarily the best games, we'd kind of grow to love them anyway. And so then when it's come to us looking at them 40 years later almost, nostalgia and, you know, our personal preferences have kind of influenced the scores that we gave them. And I think we saw that throughout the series. People did say, oh, I loved this game when I was a kid, and so they rated it the highest, even if other people might not agree with them. So fair enough. I guess what we can say in summary is Zzap, they didn't always get it right, but they did a pretty good job overall.
Absolutely right. And obviously as well, you know, there are so many good reviews of games over the years that Zzap really got it right. And it was groundbreaking as a magazine at the time, for the 64 at least. You know, we've got a lot to thank them for. It's a real sense of we all grew up with it and we all really appreciate it for what it was.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I think that about sums it up. I think this really is it for the Commodore 64 Budget Publisher Showdown. But then I said that after the final episode, and here we are. So all that remains then is for me to say thank you very much for joining me and for doing all the research into this particular episode. I wouldn't and couldn't have done it without you. So thank you very much. And until the next time, whatever that may be, that will do.
It will indeed. And thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure. And it's been really good to be involved and talk about some of these games, many of which I still love to this day. So it's really appreciated. So thank you, Matt, for putting this all together.
No problem. It's been a really enjoyable thing to do. That's the end of this edition of the Budget Publisher Showdown, and I hope you've enjoyed this look at Zzap's view of the 3 biggest budget publishers on the Commodore 64. If you've got anything to say about the content of this video, then please leave a comment, and if you've not watched any of the previous episodes in this series, then check out the playlist at the end of this video for the full set. I'll be back with more retro gaming content soon, so thanks very much for watching, and bye for now.